Okay, so back in Jersey, back and forth and back and forth. Anyway, but that's part of the whole process. You know, when I originally wrote this, um, when I did this experiment back in 2004, I was traveling well, I was writing everywhere. You know, wherever I happened to be, that's where I sat down to do the writing. And anyway, I'm back in Jersey, and I'm up to, I think this is, well, it's 4701.1902, so the 19th of February 2004, Chinese year of 4701, and by my count, this is PPM7. So yesterday, the category of provocation, or the provocative, entered into the scene. And so as the exploration of evocative speech is being developed, yesterday an aspect of evocative speech or evocative saying emerged as provocative speech, or the provocative questioning. And the key line from yesterday, let's see if I can grab it, was yeah, and this was, again, going back to Socrates. So the key sort of section from yesterday was the provocative instigates. It is a call that irritates, annoys, disturbs, excites, and thereby rouses action. In the next section, we will return to our exemplar of Socrates to look further at the way he was able to draw others into the ground of uncertainty through a provocative kind of estranging questioning. So evocative speech now emerging as a provocative kind of estranging questioning. And towards the end of the meditation yesterday, I introduced a figure who I believe I stay with for a while, and that is the one who was particularly annoyed or irritated by the question, the provocative question, and the exemplar of that question being Heidegger's "How is it with the nothing?" And that figure I called the empiricist with the spirit of generosity, who allows their irritation to give way to intrigue or wonder. And so the conclusion of the meditation was that we recognize the generosity of our colleague is an expression of her openness. She has extended herself, made herself available, has responded to provocation with interest. She has been displaced for the moment, but recognized this repositioning as an opportunity for inquiry. She's a seeker, one who has a passion for the search for meaning, to explain perhaps to a fault the worlds that appear before her. The question, how is it with the nothing, strikes her as perhaps another world to be examined. I really didn't have anyone particular in mind when I wrote that. I'd sort of conjured up that figure, that much I recall. Although I think I did take some inspiration from Conversations Along a Country Path, which is a work by Heidegger, later Heidegger, where he has three figures having a conversation or a dialogue as they walk. I'm doing this to indicate walking. And the three figures are the scholar, the teacher, and the scientist. And so, in some sense, the empiricist that I'm referring to is the scientist, perhaps, from Heidegger's Conversation Along a Country Path. Okay, so without further ado, 4701.19.02, the meditation from February the 19th, 2004. So I start with a quotation, and I believe it's from Heidegger, but there's no citation, and my note in the margin has citation with a question mark. With a studied indifference, science abandons it as what there is not. And I'm going to have to step out of character or out of the reading for a moment. That's actually from the essay, What is Metaphysics? Okay, so, and what is being abandoned is the question, how is it with the nothing? So, with a studied indifference, science abandoned it, question, as what there is not, end quote. Our generous scientist, in shifting her attention, can no longer be described as indifferent. She is enjoined in questioning. The question addresses her, rouses her, and turns her towards the location of learning. We have called this location the clearing. By being enjoined in questioning, our generous scientist has been turned around away from the static and sterile domain of beings, of what is, to the possibility of no thing, nothing. The nothing is conceded. This is a decisive moment, for it leads us to the unpacking of the question. In this unpacking, one begins to take up what is said in the question. The saying has provoked interest, but it is the said that directs poetic dialogue. In dialogue, we respond to what is said. This dialogue might be called, quote, the elaboration of the question of the nothing that will bring us to the point where an answer becomes possible or the impossibility of any answer becomes clear. The nothing is conceded. Unquote. The decisive unpacking of the question is carried forward by the initial provocation, which lingers as one side of evocative speech. Wonder was roused by the initial frustration brought on by the question's inability to satisfy the knower's need to know something. Quote, for thinking, which is always essentially thinking about something, must act in a way contrary to its own essence when it thinks of the nothing. End quote. We must recall that thinking is to be understood as that special, not to be understood as that special cognitive activity, and precisely because of the hold that this depiction has upon us, we have renamed thinking as contemplation. And here we must identify the crucial differences between a scientific and a philosophical mode of existence. We initiated this entire inquiry by taking up this persona called philosopher, and suggested that this person might aptly be called lover of learning. Here we add a further description of the philosophical way of existence by drawing a contrast with the scientific mode that, quote, would like to dismiss the nothing with a lordly wave of the hand. But in our inquiry concerning the nothing, it has now become manifest that scientific existence is possible only if in advance it holds out something into the nothing. The presumed soberness of mind and superiority of science become laughable when it does not take the nothing seriously. Only because the nothing is manifest can science make beings themselves objects of inquiry. The scientist is roused to recognize that the nothing as the ground of their work. The nothing is conceded, but what is involved in the unpacking of the question? The decisive unpacking of the question directs us toward one another and towards ourselves. By arousing wonder, the question directs us toward the draft, the unstable ground of possibility, the horizon of interpretation. The question delivers a message to us, and in doing so places us in a relation. Quote, and the relation is called hermeneutical because it brings the tidings of that message. Unquote. What are the tidings that turn us, that catch and throw us into learning? What do they say? The unpacking of the question is an attempt to respond to the message. What is it that we hear? And that's that. So my feeling after reading this is a couple things. One, it's interesting to see that in meditation, I believe this is the seventh one. Let's see, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Yep, number 7. I'm returning back to engage, not so much engage it, but bring Heidegger into the conversation with citations from the essay "What is Metaphysics?" And that's one thing. That's kind of a positive. So part of what this reading involves is going back and sort of having a sort of description of how I feel about reading this material. And I have to say that now I don't think, in fact, I know that I would not use the third person. Um, and using we and talking we is meant to draw in the reader and say, okay, reader, you're with me as I, assuming that someone would be reading this, I'm writing for readers. I have to make that point clear. And that's something that maybe I should think about and talk about. But by writing we, it's saying, okay, reader, come along and let's do this together. But there's a certain rhetorical problem with that I'm not entirely thrilled with. That is to say, to say we must recall and we initiated this inquiry, this entire inquiry. The reader didn't do that, right? The reader, especially in a work that's claiming to be phenomenological, I think is paying attention to me, to the writer, so they are listening to what I have to say. So if I were to ever have a second edition of Being and Learning come out, one of the things that I think I might do would be to replace this sort of third person with the first person, or rather the plural, sorry, and put it into the singular, right? So it's not a we, but it's an I, and that's important. That is to say, unless from some perspective, what this is about is including, as my colleague Sam Rocha has said, I'm bringing in these figures, Heidegger in this case, in this particular meditation, as interlocutors, right, as fellow sojourners, on this path of inquiry. So in that case, perhaps the we includes those figures. I hadn't thought about that really up until this moment, so that would be a possible way of thinking about it. But that would have to be some an articulation of that as a methodological move, which I think would be interesting, actually. That to take that up and to articulate that, I think that's worth doing. But it would require doing that, and I haven't done that, and I would need to do that. But in terms of the philosophy that's happening here, I think that in some respects, I'm sort of going back over some ideas, and in a way, it's interesting. I almost sort of stepped outside of the sort of phenomena that was under examination, which is to say, the figure of this scientist, and by citing Heidegger here and his particular quotations that are very critical. He talks about the scientist who would like to dismiss the nothing with the lordly wave of the hand. He says that it's the soberness of mind and superiority of science become laughable when it doesn't not take the nothing seriously. That's something that I should have really followed through on, but then I just sort of jump off on that. And that's important because I don't take that caustic tone, if you want to call it that, or I don't think it's cynical, because I think that it's in earnest, that Heidegger is making these comments. It sounds a little bit cynical in some respects, maybe even a little bitter, because it's Heidegger is calling attention to the dominance of science, which is still alive and well, and one of the reasons that I wrote this book or did this experiment was to sort of step outside of the expectations that aren't the same in philosophy of education, but they are present in philosophy of education, particularly in the writing of certain kind of journal articles, and even the legitimacy of what is the work you do, and the way that we value the work that's produced in the field, right? So, the more it maybe resembles social science, the more that it speaks in a way to issues that social scientists are also speaking to. The form of the writing, this is part of the predominance of science, the science that Heidegger is referring to in our own field. And so, this experiment, and in a way, it's a kind of a play on the idea of experimentation, which doesn't happen that often, quite frankly. But that's another issue. Perhaps I'll take that up. But taking up this project was an attempt to step outside of that discourse and the expectations that come with that discourse. But I don't, I introduced this figure, and the figure of the scientist that I introduced is one that I say operates under the spirit of generosity. So I don't have the same sort of figure in mind, or I don't have the same tone, that's what I meant to say, that Heidegger does in the way that I present science or the scientist, at least not here, and that might be the reason why I stepped away from that. It was to allow Heidegger to make the to sling the mud, so to speak, and then to get back into the question. But what's really driving this at this point in the work is the question, what is the nothing, and really getting into how this question, this strange question, has this quality of being evocative and provocative. And what I'm doing is I'm really meditating on that on that phenomena, like why that question is so strange and is so evocative. The last point I want to make is that I'm glad to see that I made this distinction between, and I came back to rather, what I call the persona of the philosopher. And persona is a category that I probably started using here in Being and Learning, or what became called Being and Learning in these writings, and then has become a category that I've been using ever since. It's a play on the Spanish word persona, which is person, but it's also persona in the English sense of it being like a figure or a character. So anyway, I was glad to see that I came back to the persona of the philosopher, and to clarify that why thinking, as I'm understanding it, needs to be called contemplation in order to make this distinction between and differentiation from thinking as a cognitive activity. It's really important, because even when I teach my courses in philosophy education, to enable students to make the shift towards thinking in this Heideggerian, Arendtian, even in the traditional sort of Platonic and Aristotelian sense, but certainly away from the cognitive and psychological way that it's understood in everyday use, and to emphasize that can be difficult, to challenge, But starting off by just making the distinction between knowledge, as a certain kind of cognitive activity that aims at acquisition and sort of scientific reasoning, if you will, but has a certain end in mind, and with it comes an emphasis on the cognitive and the psychological and the mind, and to differentiate that from thinking as a more embodied experience and as having its own characteristics. Starting off, of course, and making that distinction is usually helpful, but it is very difficult, because when one says thinking, I think this or I think that, it is usually meant as a kind of cognition, and that's not what thinking is about, as it's being explored in this work. So contemplation, I was glad to see that I came back and underlined the sense of the persona of the philosopher being involved in an activity called thinking, that is contemplation. So that's it for PPM7 or 4701.1902. Oops.